3 दिनदेखि चलिरहेको चौतारी कन्फरेन्सको यो अन्तिम ग्रान्ड फिनाले जस्तै हो। त्यसमा पनि सहभागी भइदिनुभएका सबैलाई चौतारीको तर्फबाट र मेरो तर्फबाट पनि व्यक्तिगत रूपमा धन्यवाद दिन चाहन्छु। मलाई लाग्छ यहाँहरूले यो 3 दिनको कार्यक्रम उपलब्धिमूलक नै पाउनुभयो होला र हामीले पनि तपाईँहरूबाट त्यसमा भएको सहभागिता, त्यसमा भएको चाहिँ सहकार्यबाट हामीले पनि थप ऊर्जा प्राप्त गर्छौँ जस्तो हामीलाई लाग्छ। यो कार्यक्रम हामी निरन्तर रूपमा प्रत्येक वर्ष चलाइ नै राख्ने हाम्रो प्रतिबद्धता छ। त्यसमा तपाईँहरूको साथ सहयोग र तपाईँहरूको त्यसमा केही फिडब्याक छ भने त्यो पनि पाउन पाएदेखि हामी अर्को वर्ष अर्को संस्करणमा यस्ता अझ बढी परिष्कृत रूपले अगाडि ल्याउन सक्छौँ भन्ने आग्रहसहित यहाँहरूलाई फेरि यहाँ आइदिनु भएकोमा धन्यवाद। मेरो CK लाल दाइलाई विशेष यो कार्यक्रममा बोल्ने मन्तव्य दिने जुन उहाँले गरिदिनु भयो त्यसको लागि चाहिँ सदा चाहिँ हामी कृतज्ञ नै रहन्छौँ भन्दै फेरि यहाँहरूलाई स्वागत गर्न चाहन्छु। धन्यवाद। र CK लालजीको अब हामी औपचारिक रूपमा यो कार्यक्रम सुरु गर्दाखेरि CK लालजीको चाहिँ परिचयबाट सुरु गर्छौँ। त्यो गर्न म डाक्टर प्रत्युष वन्तजीलाई फेरि आग्रह गर्छु।
थ्याङ्क यू कुमार। यो के अरे सार्वजनिक रूपमा 4-5वटा भाषा बोल्ने मान्छेहरूले चाहिँ बोल्ने मान्छेहरूलाई चाहिँ यस्तो कार्यक्रममा निम्ताउँदाखेरि हामीले प्रायः चाहिँ तपाईँ कुन भाषामा बोल्ने भनेर सोध्नुपर्ने हुन्छ। अनि CK दाइलाई हामीले केही महिना अगाडि यो आजको व्याख्यान लेक्चर दिने कुरो थम्याउनलाई हामीले अनुरोध गर्दाखेरि चाहिँ लेख्ने अङ्ग्रेजीमा धेरै जसो बोल्ने पनि अङ्ग्रेजीमा तर नेपाली पनि मिसिया भनेर उहाँले भन्नुभएको थियो। आज मैले अहिले रिकन्फर्म गरेँ अङ्ग्रेजीमै बोल्ने हो भन्दाखेरि हो भन्नुभयो। अनि अब मलाई परिचय दिनु मलाई पनि अङ्ग्रेजी अलिअलि आउँछ अनि मैले पनि त्यो उहाँको परिचय पनि अङ्ग्रेजीमै दिदिउँ कि भन्ने लाग्यो मलाई पनि। ल हुन्छ नि त। अनि I realized that I've been introducing CK Lal for 30 years and I've actually proved that I've done that for 30 years. Very recently when I was cleaning up my study, I found a piece of paper in which I had organized a talk program about the then new FM radios in Kathmandu. And having not met him ever before, I invited him to that program. It was held in the alumni organization of the school I studied in GAA. And that was the first meeting we had. If I remember that the month, it was September, late September, early October, 1995. So I've been introducing him for 35 years. A lot of people know him as probably the most important public commentator on all things Nepali, politics and otherwise for the last 35 years. Personally, I started reading him in 1990. He had a column in then English weekly newspaper called The Independent. Independent came in this particular size. I don't know what it's called, but he had a column that would go from the top to the bottom, and I would read it very religiously. From 92 onwards, I also started writing a bit for the newspaper. Later on, after we got to know each other, and the FM radio was created in town, for almost 2 years, little over a year plus, we actually had a radio talk show between the two of us in Radio Sagarmatha. Obviously, some people in this Angan were not born then, but those of you who might remember that program, it had a title, something called Susasan in the title, but that was just because the radio needed a title for the program. We basically didn't pay any attention and we talked about whatever we felt like talking about. So this was a weekly show. So that went on for quite a few months, more than a year, in 98, 99. In all these years, we've been all reading him. He always gives us food for thought, whether it's written in English or Nepali, currently in the pages of Kantipur and the Kathmandu Post, previously in other newspapers and magazines. He's written prolifically on every topic probably under the sun. Apart from his public commenting, he also appears in TV programs I obviously don't watch him watch TV programs, so I don't know exactly how frequently he shows up in them. But he's a very popular commentator for TV programs as well as the new YouTube channels. In the mode of a longer academic reflections and articles, he's also published several chapters in various volumes and magazines. I will read some of them. Imagining South Asia in a Unipolar World, that's the title of one. The Complexities of Border Conflicts in South Asia. Nepal's Maoवादी, Cultural Flows Across a Blurred Boundary. Nepal's Quest for Modernity. And Ramraja Prasad Singh, The Warrior Gentleman, the last of which was published in a volume edited by our French colleagues on the Maoist Revolution. From Chautari, we published his thought piece called Nepali Hunalai, र मिथिला मन्थनमा पनि उहाँको सामग्रीहरू प्रकाशन भएका छन् मैथिलीमा. In 2006, he was voted the most prominent columnist of Nepal and covered as one of the 15 influential Nepalis of the decade in 2014 by Nepal magazine. उहाँलाई नाटक पनि उहाँले लेख्नु भएको छ. सपनाको साबिती was staged in 2010 to popular acclaim. He's been an Asia Leadership Fellow in Japan in 2008, a Fellow of Public Life and Public Knowledge here at Chautari back in 2010, and Pointer Fellow 2013 at Yale University in the US. His current areas of interest, I think, could be summarized as everything under the sun, but is particularly interested in the future of democracy in Nepal, on issues related to nationality, on the power of ethno-nationalism, on secular ideas, on the idea of secularity, and on the institutionalization of plurality. Today he'll be speaking in English, but he could as well be speaking in Maithili, Nepali, Hindi, or a few other languages. So Sikeda, it's all yours. He'll speak for about 55 minutes to 1 hour.
Thank you, Dr. Thank you, Dr. That is a very kind introduction. I don't know where to begin. I think we have to begin with greetings. Good afternoon, organizers, guests, and fellow participants. I have attended quite a few Chautari Foundation lectures in the past and benefited from erudite and articulate presentation of some of the leading lights of Nepali polity and society. अंग्रेजीमा मेरो विचारमा अंग्रेजीमा धेरै ठाउँमा बोलेको छु, तर पढेको अंग्रेजी होस् कि नेपाली होस् कि मैथिली होस्, यो 35 वर्षमा पब्लिक पर्फर्मेन्समा पहिलोचोटि हो. के पर्यो भने यहाँ त सबै डक्टर मार्टिन चौतारीमा अलिकति लेखेको भयो भने सजिलो हुन्छ भनेर, and so I'm going to read it. Please bear with me. Since the series began in 2015, several distinguished figures have delivered profound and insightful lectures. From an eminent development practitioner Vikas Pandey to the critic of traditional development ideology Devendra Pandey, and from celebrated novelist and essayist Manjushree Thapa to an established lawyer and noted politician Radheshyam Adhikari, I have shared scholarly analysis and profound wisdom in their I benefited from scholarly analysis and profound wisdom of their presentations. For the full list of luminaries, the interested person can always go to the website of Martin Chautari, where it is available. Researchers have their findings to share with confidence. Scholars possess the knowledge to speak with authority about their areas of expertise. The learned can impart wisdom. I possess no such quality. I am just a newspaper columnist and a public commentator. In all humility, I have to state it in the beginning that my submission is neither authoritative nor scholarly, but merely a reflection based on bits of information, some personal experiences, and a touch of emotion. what they call a writerly presentation. A war cry of the feminist movement thunders. Personal is political. And so are the experiences of all subaltern groups when faced with oppressive power of hegemonic social structures. A clarification about the choice of language is also in order. On the Nepalese side of the international border in Mithila, from where I come, it is sometimes said that we learn to speak in Maithili, pray in Sanskrit slok, read Nepali in school textbooks, shop in Hindi in the market, talk about love and longing in Urdu Sayari couplet, and begin to pontificate in English when slightly tipped. About the use of English, Maithils on both sides of the border agree. When you don't know what you are talking about but still want to sound profound, use English. For example, I know that I know nothing, but how will you know that I know nothing until I tell you that I know nothing? No? So you tell it in English, sounds great. Sounds philosophical? Actually, it's gibberish. I know because I sometimes employ this technique when I'm asked to say something about things that I know nothing about. यहाँ चौतारीमा के छ भने सबै विद्वानहरू केही सोधिहाल्यो म त मेरो बानी त्यो त मलाई थाहा छैन. For a public commentator, it's very difficult to say I don't know. We have to say something about things that we know nothing about, and this technique comes in very handy. It requires tremendous courage to admit one's ignorance. Let me gather some such courage and confess that I'm equally bad in all these languages. If that sounds contradictory, my earlier claim of being writerly, well, it is contradictory. I'm one of those whose language has been stolen, We learn to speak in one language and the whole life we have to spend in some other language. So, someone of the stolen language. Life, after all, is full of contradictions. English is my choice of this lecture for one simple reason. The organizers, especially Dr. Lok Ranjan Parajuli, he thinks that, I can become an academic. Dr. Pratiswant has given up. They tried for 3 decades and then gave up. No, CK Lal Lok Ranjan Ramesh still thinks. The organizers of this event required that presentation be in a written form, and I find it easier to type in English than in Devanagari. I type with one finger, and it's much easier in English than in Nepali. I beg your indulgence with my passable English. My vocabulary is limited. I often miss the nuances, and my pronunciation is sometimes atrocious, as you must have found out by now. With these two disclaimers, I request you to bear with me on my reminiscence about today's topic, reflections of a Madheshi about Nepali mainstream, history, memory, recollections, and remembrances. I don't know if I have to read the abstract because it has been distributed, but I'll read it anyway. I'm going to question Victor's accounts of Nepal's past. A personal memoir, most often penned by prominent politicians and retired bureaucrats, continue the long tradition of courtiers' chronicles, offering rose-tinted retrospectives filled with selective memories that reinforce dominant historical narratives. Interview-based recollections, frequently ghost-written or mediated through muted voice of the recorder, have emerged as another popular genre. Audio-visual media now provide additional forums for recording and publicizing the reminiscences of public figure. You see, the problem of reading from written text. I have written here, please take a deep breath here and look at the audience. So I'm doing that. A rich tapestry of such narratives allows us to examine from the margins how hegemony is intellectually produced and reproduced as the national, quote unquote, national imagination. Madheshis whose land, language, and lifeways have long been intertwined with the history and culture of the Ganga plains, as are central to understanding Nepal as the monarchical histories of the hill regions. yet they remain largely absent from these memoirs and recollections. This lecture explores how Madhesh occupies little space not only in Nepal's historiographical tradition but also in the memories of those who have shaped the very idea of Nepal. By tracing anecdotes, recollections, and hazy memories of prominent personalities, it reflects on the silences and distortions in the making of a lopsided, quote-unquote, national memory, one that continues to shape countries' politics and culture today. गला सबका सूखता है. I'll go into the what I have called manufactured history. Back in the 1970s, students were asked to choose between geography and history for the examination of school leaving certificate, or the SLC. In my time, it was called an iron gate for entry into the job market or admission to college. In much of Madhesh, teachers often suggested good students, quote unquote, in their eyes to go for geography, because I remember our assistant headmaster telling me there is nothing about us in Nepal's history, quote unquote us. A course book that we had to read as a part of the English language, Heroes and Builders of Nepal by Hrishikesh Saha, indeed had almost nothing about Madhesh or Madheshis. While I learned to draw the map of Nepal and mugged up the population of different districts in school in geography, I missed the chance to really examine whether the history of our country had anything about us. I realized later that while our assistant headmaster was correct in his assessment, perhaps I should have studied the subject anyway and history on my own. The history of the landmass of today's Nepal is as old as human habitation in these parts of the world. In most parts of the world, that is. Even if the Gopalas and Mahishpalas of Bansavali are considered part myth, part lore, and part imagination, the recorded history of Nepal Valley, Kathmandu Valley in contemporary parlance, is definitely more than 2,000 years old, with Kirats, Lichvis, Thakmallas having ruled the region for a long time. But the idea of Nepal as a centralized kingdom, an evolving republic after 2008, begins with the victorious king of Gorkha Principality shifting his capital to Kathmandu after defeating all the three Malla kings one by one by 1769. The history of modern Nepal in that sense begins with the rise of King Prithvinaran Shah and the exploits of warriors and courtiers that came with him to the Kathmandu Valley. Among all the legends about King Prithvinarayan, the one about his encounter with Guru Gorakhnath is most compelling. I think most of you have heard about it, but I'll read it anyway. Like many foundational figures elsewhere, many countries foundational figures, sometimes they say that Devi gave the sword, sometimes, there was a thunder, and that gave the authority. So like many foundational figures elsewhere, first Saha of Nepal is bound to a potent creation myth, one which links his worldly success directly to the divine. The popular legend recounts an encounter between the young Saha and Guru Gorakhnath, a revered godlike figure outside a cave in the Gorkha Principality that probably took its name from the revered Guru. In this telling, the yogi requests a bowl of curd, which the boy Saha dutifully fetches from the palace. The Guru takes the bowl, regurgitates the content, puts it upon the hands of the young Saha and asks him to drink it up. Repulsed, the confused Saha lets the curd to spill and dribble down his toes onto the ground. Instead of simply cursing him, Guru Gorakhnath offered a curious prophecy. Saha would conquer every piece of land his feet touched. Yet, this divine endorsement came with a subtle shadow, for another verse maintains that the exalted Guru, enraged by the boy's refusal to drink the offering, pronounced a curse, a political expiration date, declaring that the Saha dynasty would rule Nepal for precisely 10 generations. This single visceral moment of thus anchors the Shah dynasty's entire history in a blend of glorious divine blessing and preordained political doom. This story aligns with Sanskrit expression itihasa, a Sanskrit term that literally translates to thus indeed it happened, commonly associated with Ramayana and Mahabharata. These epics are considered itihas because they were narrated by Valmiki, the first writer of Ramayana, who actually sheltered Sita when she was thrown out of Ayodhya. So eyewitness account. And Vyasa, who was also not just eyewitness, but from the same dynasty that created this Mahabharata, with direct links to the unfolding events and were blessed with divine vision. King Prithvinarayan is elevated to the blessed status with the narration of his encounter with Guru Gorakhnath. It is possible that someone connected with the Gorkha court either saw or concocted the story to manufacture a itihas in the established Hindu tradition. So, divine sanction for the project of Gorkha Empire. The works of Ludwig F. Stiller, I don't know if I'm pronouncing the name of his name, especially the rise of House of Gorkha, study in unification of Nepal 1768-1816 and the silent cry, the people of Nepal 1860-1839, grounds the history in the political economy of land military complex of Jagir, land grant system, and its unraveling when the Treaty of Sugauli in 1860 put an end to the continuous expansion of the Gorkhali Empire. The Gorkha court acquired the loyalty of its soldiers through a system that financed the army by continuously conquering new lands and offering it to soldiers as also to administrators as Jagir. While historian Stiller distinctly hears the silent cry emanating from hills and mountains and valleys, he fails to notice the sobs of Madheshi, where Jagir were granted to military and civil officers as if it was all terrae incognitae, the terra incognita, economic resource at the frontier to be cleared, measured, surveyed, and appropriated for distribution to the loyalists. The fault lies in the scientific way of recording history, supposedly neutral and ostensibly objective, that has to rely upon documented accounts of the past. Justly celebrated for its imperial rigor and scholarly detail, particularly in Nepali economic history, fact-based and well-documented accounts of Mahesh Chandra Regmi possess all the strength of scientific history, which is also its weakness. The strength is the weakness. It has to rely upon royal correspondences and land records to be verifiable, even when it has to miss the silences and gaps in the archival material. In his influential work, Silencing the Past, Power and Production of History, Haitian-American anthropologist Michel Rolfe Trulon argues that history is not simply a record of what happened, under quotes, but a process shaped by power. Power that determines what is recorded, power that determines what is preserved, power that determines what is remembered. As he notes, silences enter the process of historical production at four crucial moments. The moment of fact creation, fact is created, of fact assembly, it is assembled, of fact retrieval, it is retrieved, and of retrospective significance. In this way, the histories of marginalized groups are often overshadowed or overwritten, their experiences effectively colonized in the name of facts. The emotional core of Nepali nationalism is somehow a shallow belief that Nepal was the only country in South Asia to be never colonized. That's partly true. If by colonizer one means colonization by an European country or an imperial power like Japan. After the Sugauli Treaty, Nepal became subordinate to the East India Company in every way. Jang Bahadur Kuwar, the de facto ruler after the Kot massacre of 1846, strengthened the allegiance when he helped East India Company fight the Sepoy Mutiny in 1857, later called the First War of Independence in India, participated in the sack of Lucknow, brought back the loot, and dutifully accepted the baksheesh for his loyalty in the form of authority over Naya Muluk, the new territory. While it is true that he sheltered some mutineers in Nepal's territory, almost certainly for substantial financial consideration, he assured the EIC officials that Nana Sahib, the most dangerous of them all, quote unquote, had probably died, and Begum Zinat Mahal was kept under constant watch in almost a condition of house arrest. Contrary to the commonly held view, Chandra Shamsher solidified the subordinate relationship with the British. He allowed them to recruit more and more Gurkhas and helped their warrior force with men, money, and material. Denied territorial reward for his immense contribution in World War I. Actually, he wrote several times that Jang was given Naya Muluk, so I should also be given land for my loyalty, but it was denied. But in lieu of that, he was given an annual financial payment and a SOP in the form of a treaty in 1923 that recognized Nepal's independence but retained its foreign policy and external trade in the hands of British India. This emotional core of never having been colonized of Nepali nationalism is thus even more hollow than divine sanction and economic justification. Perhaps the most impactful phase of nationalistic historicization began concurrently with the Indian independence movement, was partly inspired by the celebrated bravery of Gurkhas in the World War II, and was spearheaded by Gorkhalis in exile in what I have called in several places ABCD, Assam, Banaras, Calcutta, and Darjeeling conclaves. Though the Sudhapa of Surya Bikram Gyavali, Dharnidhar Koirala, and Parasmani Pradhan are most celebrated for consolidated the cultural identity of Nepali Jati. The farmers in Assam, the Pandits of Banaras, the traders of Calcutta, teachers in Darjeeling, and pensioners in Dehradun longed for a home, even if a lost one, that they could call their own. This diasporic longing for homeland or long-distance nationalism have been studied in detail, but it will be a diversion, so I don't go into it. The ethno-national formation of one Nepali Jati, irrespective of their domicile, based on a shared language, common cultural heritage, and unique national character of martial, perhaps inspired by German romantic thinker Johann Gottfried Herder's idea of Volksgeist, succeeded in othering Madheshis from the imagination of nation forever. Once he had succeeded in restoring the centrality of monarchy through the 1960 Royal Military Coup, King Mahendra strategically institutionalized the ethno-national identity of Nepali Jati into a state ideology, which came called Bir history, history of the brave, a term probably coined by Dr. Pratyuswanta. This nationalist doctrine, designed to legitimize the Panchayat regime, violently solidified the idea of Nepaliness around four non-negotiable pillars: Hindu religion, the king as an avatar, Nepali as a sole language, and an uncompromising pride in indivisibility and sovereignty inherited from brave ancestors. Actually, when I was in school, we did not have this Sriman Gambhir thing even in Panchayat era. It's Madhav Ghimir's song, Gaun Cha Gita Nepali. A line, I think, पश्चिम किल्ला काङ्गडा पूर्वमा टिस्टा पुगेथ्यौँ कुन शक्तिका सामु हामी कहिले हामी झुकेथ्यौँ later I learned to wonder झुके थिएन भने what happened to Kila Kangra and what happened to Tista, this contradiction. But this state-sponsored narrative fundamentally and deliberately excluded the Madheshis, along with a few other marginalized groups, by denying legitimacy to their language, culture, and territorial identity. The Dipyopadesh, Divine Counsel, purportedly a collection of instruction to the inheritors of Gorkhali Empire from its founder, King Prithvinarayan, was discovered in the early 1950s and soon became the foundational text of absolute monarchy. Its quotable quotes, yam between two boulders, quote unquote, formulation, geopolitical doctrine, and the quote-unquote Garden of 4 castes and 36 ethnicities as the social inclusion thesis continued to be touted as the foresight of the victorious Saha. Critics of the text argue that the collection is of a later vintage and was to justify the centrality of monarchy in Nepal's national life without any role in it for Madheshis or Janajatis outside of the central mountainous region around the Gandak belt. It's not just Madheshis, even Janajatis of east, particularly east of Kosi and west of Karnali, do not occur in this imagination. Perhaps other scholars too have critiqued the ethno-national Nepal that was manufactured to maintain the hegemony of monarchists in national life and was relentlessly propagated through school textbooks and government media during the Panchayat era. But in my reading, no one has shed such a powerful light upon the process of bits of historicity and dollops of imagination to produce a cultural identity of Gorkhali greatness. The Bir history, exemplified by warrior Balbhadra, the invention of Bhanubhakta's Ramayana by Motiram Bhatta, and the kindness of King Mahendra that made him update the Hindu code of Jang Bahadur called the Bulki Ain. What happens is, no one more than Pratiswanta, I have to repeat it again, through his scholarly writings and public interactions at different forums. Wanta's thesis remained among the most underrated examination of how modern Nepali history was hegemonized through state-sponsored historiography of Saharana, through curricula of the school and state-controlled media. When a lie collectively agreed upon, that becomes something like a truth, quote unquote. When a collective starts to agree upon a lie, then it is possible to add recent history of creating administrative geography to marginalize Madhesh, the appropriation of Neva, specifically Malla architecture of exposed bricks and pagoda as Nepali, promotion of Shakt and Saiv sects of Hinduism as and the propagation of Buddha was born in Nepal to sideline the issue of religious diversity. Well, all that is unnecessary. Over the centuries, the exclusionary idea of Nepal has solidified into what the builder of Gorkhali Empire purportedly had called Dhungo, a sacred rock beyond any sacrilegious questioning. It is sacrilegious to question this Dhungo. As I said, my pronunciation. Where was I? There is a reason even elite Madheshis often bring out a Tamarpatra inscription of copper plate or a patta, royal edict on Lokta paper from the Gorkhali court to prove their belongingness. Unless they have one, as if they don't have one, then they don't belong. A line in Kashmiri American poet Agha Shahid Ali's farewell wails in anguish. Your history gets in the way of my memory. Your history gets in the way of my memory. But what happens when grand historical narratives, relentlessly pervaded by the hegemonic power, destroys the personal memories of the externalized population? Quote unquote, maybe it just sags like a heavy load, as Langston Hughes speculates in his short poem Harlem. It's a very short poem, but I'm not quoting all. I have just given a line. Those of you interested, it is freely available on the net. You read it. The Itihas Shiromani, historian laureate Baburam Acharya, is justly respected by the hegemonic Nepali mainstream for his 4-part biography of King Prithvinarayan Saha, the discovery of Divyopadesh, and the naming of Mount Everest as Sagarmatha. He became highly popular for his admonishing collection of essays, Aba Yasto Kaile Nahos, Let This Never Happen Again, that recounts foibles and follies of the Gorkha, a young widow from a prominent and wealthy family of Maithil Brahmins, as merely a pilgrim from the plains that had come for the darshan of Pashupatinath during Shivratri, got me thinking. Why does Madheshi, on rare occasions when they do manage to get a brief mention in official narratives, are dismissed as marginal characters? The memory of Kantbati as a brave woman has almost been erased by the official accounts of Gorkhali history, even in Mithila. Till my generation, we were told that she was a brave, very intelligent lady that went and became the queen of Nepal. So that no longer exists even in Madhesh, because 2 or 3 generations have learned their history only from textbooks. They have not been told these stories about Kantapati. Historian John Whelpton has utilized his lifetime of studying Nepal in his authoritative book, A History of Nepal. The volume has a 13-page index at the end, a characteristic not very common with books published from Nepal, except for the one published by Martin Chautari, I must add. I checked it before sitting down to reflect over the omission of Madheshis from scholarly accounts. It lists languages of Madhesh, Avdi, Bhojpuri, Maithili, and Hindi, and a few Madheshi names. About Kantbati, all that Whelpton has to say is the union of the Maithil Brahmin widow with Ran Bahadur Saha was, quote unquote, illicit. You know, when I read, I mean, it was quite a few years ago, but I still find that wording very uncomfortable. Perhaps perils of relying too much upon hegemonic accounts of the past and interlocutors with ethno-nationalist convictions are self-evident in the much-referred book for expatriates working in Nepal. The expurgation of Kantapati's story is a classic example of victor's history being adopted even by descendants of the vanquished, a consequence of decades-long state project that succeeded in making the Gorkhali narrative the default national consciousness. While the Kashmiris at least have figures like Aga Shahid Ali to lament their lot, the Madheshi intelligentsia either meekly conform to the official narrative or focus on contemporary political issues of inclusion, federalism, language rights, citizenship, even when they manage to rise above individual grievances. Little do they realize that history and memory are powerful tools of control and subjugation. The one who owns your history, I think Orwell, owns your present. The ones who owns your present owns your past, and the one who owns your past also owns your future. You know, so this memory is important. Now let me come to divided memories, the third part of my tidbits. Theoretically, I was perhaps too young to remember. This is very personal. Theoretically, I was perhaps too young to remember, but somehow the incident got etched in my memory, perhaps due to the emotional imprint of the encounter. At the end of winter, when the rice has been harvested, chickpea plants were growing green among the dry husk of the paddies, and wheat had been sown in the irrigated fields, villagers of Mithila region traveled to Janakpur on the full moon day for a dip in the Ganga Sagar pond. I have written about it in Kantipur, I think in one of the columns in Independent, and mentioned it in few interviews also. Sometime in the early 1960s, I was one of the pilgrims to Janakpur for this full moon day dip. On my way to the town, I was stopped by the sentry of the barracks of the then Royal Nepal Army in Parikauli. That barrack is still there. I don't remember the question in Nepali or my answer in Maithili, but the memory of the soldiers' reprimand, speak in Nepali, still resounds in my mind. I uttered the only Nepali word I knew then, Janepal, picked up from embroidered expression on pillow covers that women on the north of the international border had learned to imitate from Jai Hind in India. Takia kholma Janepal bhareko hunthyo. Anti-national, the sentry had shouted with the bayonet on my chest, Arashtriya Tattva. That perhaps in the early 60s was a very popular word. Anti-national, the sentry had shouted with the bayonet on my chest as he checked my cloth bag and asked me to say aloud after him, Jagadesh, Janaresh. I obliged, but perhaps I was too terrified to say it loud enough. The bayonet touched my shirt and I probably wet myself. The soldier called something like, you cowardly Madheshi, and allow me to go. Decades after the shameful experience, shameful for me and shameful for the state, I would involuntarily shiver in fear as I rode a bicycle or drove along that road. I later learned to rationalize that had the soldier spoken my language, looked like one of my elder brothers or uncles, or been trained to treat subjects of the Sahar realm with kindness, my fear won't have bothered me for so long. How wrong I was in reaching such a hasty conclusion. Soon after becoming the interim head of government after the restoration of parliamentary democracy in the country in 1990, Prime Minister Krishna Prasad Bhattarai traveled to New Delhi. While in the Indian capital, he was asked why Madheshis weren't recruited in the Nepal army. Perhaps due to a lifetime of conditioning in ethno-nationalist values, he retorted that journalists should ask the Indian government why it had a Gorkha brigade and not even a battalion for Madheshis, or words to that effect. It was a statement insulting his own citizen on foreign soil. When his expressions were celebrated as a nationalist and witty retort in the Nepali media and society, I realized that the descendants of the Pandit from Gorkha, Bharat Shamsher recounts in his memoir that Bhattarai once boasted that his ancestors had traced their journey from Gorkha to Kathmandu following the droppings of King Prithvi Narayan's horse. In 1990 was no different from semi-educated sentry of Parikoli barracks in the early 1960s when it came to the ethno-nationalist values of Nepaliness. I have written about this also several times, but the supposed therapeutic effect of narration hasn't worked to lessen the pain. I still find it painful. The memory of reading a memory accentuates the lingering issue of systematic discrimination and historical injustice. B.P. Koirala, a scion of a noble Brahmin family tracing its aristocratic origin to the court of Makmanpur Principality, and the favorite son of a progressive Rana-era revenue contractor, lived a multifaceted life. He was born in Banaras, grew up on the banks of Cochin River Tehri, was educated in Banaras and Calcutta, practiced law in Darjeeling. Furthermore, he wrote short stories initially in Hindi and later in Nepali, was jailed by the British in India as well as the Ranas and Sahas in Nepal, spearheaded the armed revolution at least twice, became the first elected Prime Minister of the country, and was one of the pioneers of the international socialist movement in South Asia. By all accounts, he was a Renaissance man of sorts of Nepal, though of somewhat tragic kind, denounced in life as an anti-national and celebrated as nationalist by and monarchists alike after the country became a republic. He has been consigned to conservative and a supporter of monarchy. I read it fast because this is something which almost everybody seems to know. Better known by his initials BP, his admirers and critics alike, BP was a politician before he became a writer and remained a writer even after he had become a successful politician. An American writer of historical fiction, E.L. Doctorow is reputed to have defined the writer as a professional rememberer. All writers are rememberer who mine their memories. Of course, imagination is important, but memory is important. Most writers mine their memory for the raw material of their work. BP admits that his experiences of Teddy village have been used for his short stories and novellas. But it is his memoir, Afno Katha story, Atmavrittant, self-narration, translated as late life recollections into English by Kathmandu Dixit, and Feri Sundarizal, again Sundarizal, where the interpretative art of his past shines through. Like many Madheshis of my generation, I have been a lifelong admirer of BP and have used that privilege to critique his earlier attitude towards Madheshis. Later, there is a lot of change, which I am not going into here. His attachment to the West during the Cold War and his late life appreciation of the role of monarchy. He was a Mahamanav, great human indeed, but no idol on the pedestal is without some clay on its feet. Perhaps due to his limited exposure to everyday life in Madhesh, BP retains the traditional view of Madheshis as outsiders to the imagination of mainstream Nepali. In Feri Sundarizal, he recounts, "Now I am 62 years old. Of these years, I have spent 19 in Kathmandu and 4 in Biratnagar, that is 23 in Nepal, 2 years in Chandraganj, present-day Sirha, Madar, making it 25 years in Nepal, 19 years in Banaras, 8 years in Patna, 5 years in Tedi, 3 years in Calcutta, 2 years in Hazaribagh, and 1 year in Darjeeling, altogether 38 years in India. Looking at it on the basis of work and activity, I have spent 17 years studying, 12 years in prison, 20 years in exile, and 2 years in government. In India and Nepal combined, I have spent 26 years in active politics." His years spent in Madhesh, 4 in Biratnagar and 2 in Chandraganj, is mostly during his childhood when elders in the family helped frame the view of society. The familial Pahadi-bound attitude to our Madheshis or even Janjatis was so strong that it remained stuck in his mind despite his otherwise democratic politics and progressive socio-cultural convictions. Here I quote an incident that has been used by BP in Afno Katha, Atmavrittant, and some of his interviews, at least 2 or 3 that I have read in different publications. It has been corroborated by his elder half-brother MP Koirala, as well as a powerful courtier of the Chandrasamsher and the in-law of the Koirala family, Rambani Acharya Dixit. I am using the shorter version from the translation of Kathmandu Dixit because the main point that I want to make remains unaltered. This is in a quote. "When my father was living in Chandraganj, an incident occurred that brought a significant change in his life. Chandraganj is a bazaar just past Jayanagar in India, which has been settled by my father himself. This is only partly true. Chandranagar Bazaar, of course, but the village is quite old, Madar. There was a small customs post near Sirha. The office was on the high bank of a large and lovely pond, and our house was across the road. I remember. Mother used to dress me up and send me over to the office. I used to wait by the side of the road because of the dust, and someone going across would take me to my father. That also I remember. I used to listen to the discussions at the office, although I did not understand them. I must have been quite the center of attraction with my fine clothes and also because of father. Once some Dhakre porters came by, as they usually did during the winter. A large group of Dhakres was there. watching my father, who was supervising the weighing of something on the large scale. It was quite cold. My father saw the torn clothes and felt very bad. We heard with us a man named Asarfi Misra. His son visits me now and then. Father told him, have some clothes made for them and bring me a set of what they are wearing. Cloth was brought from the shop nearby. New cloths were sewn. Father then tied up the old sets in a parcel and sent them to Chandra Shamsher. He attached a sarcastic note which said, Sarkar, I am sending this parcel so that you can see the difference between your clothes and the public's clothes. The parcel might smell when it is opened, so please have it unpacked at a distance. Nepali Congress stalwart Pradeep Giri, an ardent admirer and a respectful critique of Koiralas in Nepali politics, gives the context of the so-called courageous act. Krishna Prasad considered himself a trusted confidant of the Rana Prime Minister. This situation suddenly changed. He received signals that he would be imprisoned and stripped of all his property. Probably such a possibility has arisen because the Koirala senior had delayed or defaulted in depositing the contracted amount of the revenue into the national treasury. It has been rightly said that remembering requires repetition, and repetition changes what we remember. The later narration omits important details about the purpose of Dhakres coming down from the mountains mentioned in the Afno Katha. They came down to the plains to buy daily necessities such as salt, oil, or find some work. Atpritant also elevates the father to a master supervising his minions at work, which isn't there in the original telling. But the way a respectful misirji of his father, misir is a respectful way of addressing, someone equal, a Brahmin. But the way respectful Misirji of his father becomes a man named Asarfi Misra, whose son still visits BP now and then, displays an attitude unbecoming of a national leader and an international personality. But it comes from a very ethno-national viewpoint. Somewhat like Chandranigahpur of Rauthat that has been shortened to Chapur, Chandraganj too has recovered its earlier name Mahadar. What still remains is the tendency of Pahari elite to turn a blind eye towards the suffering of Madheshis. There must have been as poor Madheshi Dalits in Chandraganj as Pahari Dhakres. But the revenue contractor didn't consider their langoti or golgala or their torn clothes worthy of being parceled to the Sarkar in Kathmandu, even as they derived their wealth, power and prestige from Madhesh. By him, BP himself shows his haughtiness when he finds Saroj Koirala in Mahattari. I'll repeat it again, sorry. BP himself shows his haughtiness when he feeds Saroj Koirala in Mahattari, despite the reservations of his colleague Ram Narayan Misra, feeds an unknown person. I mean, he has forgotten even the name, Bini Madhav Prasad Singh. Feels an unknown person, quote unquote, to face Bhadrakali Misra and shows Vedanand Jha his place in Saptari by putting up Madhav Regni as an official candidate in Saptari. His supporters in Madhesh backed up the choice of their leader unhesitatingly, all of them own, but neither BP nor any Nepali Congress leader since then has shown the courage to display the integrative character of the party by fielding, let alone getting elected a Madheshi from anywhere in Pahad. Mainstream recollections, the fourth part of my presentation. I hope somebody is keeping time. While in school, I read the first 2 volumes of Hindi poet Harivansh Rai Bachchan's 4-part autobiography, Kya Bhulu, Kya Yaad Karu, to remember, what to forget, and Need Ka Nirman Fir, the nest is built again, over a long summer holiday. I was enchanted by the content and language of these books. I never got a chance to read the other two parts, but I still think that no matter how good a poet the professor of English, Harivansh Rai Bachchan, was, his Hindi prose flows with the serenity and intensity of River Ganga in Haridwar. When I started to read non-official publications in Nepali, I need to qualify it. Whatever Nepali I know has been learned from Gorkhapatra and Radio Nepal. Very few Nepali books I read initially. Even now I find it slightly difficult. I mean, I find it difficult to read English too, but even more difficult to read Nepali. So that's why I have used this term. When I started to read non-official publications in Nepali, I began with the genre of memoir rather than stories, novels, essays, or poems, expecting a similar experience. My initial disappointments remain intact to this day. Most Nepali publications based on the bygone years of their authors that I have read are recollections lacking both the depth of emotions and the breadth of experiences. They are mere records of events, missing honest attempts to examine feelings, beliefs, and meanings that such experiences generated. If memory serves me right, I read Rammani Dixit Purana Samjana, Old Memories, and Kashinath Dixit's Bhaye Ka Kura, Things That Happened, with some effort, because the content of these failed to resonate with a reader unfamiliar with events in and out of Rana palaces in Kathmandu. I don't know which of the Dixit's descendant I was talking to sometime in the late 1990s, but a professional Dixit, I have forgotten the first name, educated abroad with a passport issued by the British India in Calcutta, because Kathmandu had no right to issue a passport, once asked me at a social gathering the name of the Rana or Saha Darbar I was attached to. He looked incredulous when I replied that no, I don't know any Darbars, and said, waving towards the gathering in a five-star hotel, then you won't last in this kind of society. Perhaps such tidbits would go to make a memoir of Nepali kind if I decided to collect them, but I don't intend to do that. Although Kamalmani Dixit wrote across genres, his recollective sensibility, rooted in personal memory, cultural nostalgia, and anecdotal narrative, runs so strongly through his oeuvre that even works based on new and unpublished information are often read as forms of recollection. The collection of his apparently random writings, Birse Ko Samjhe Ko, Forgotten Remembered, is a representative work that researcher journalist Mohan Mainali introduces on the back cover thus. Participants write about the times they have lived in the very moment of experiencing them, either in their mind or on paper. If they have written it in their mind first and later transfer it onto paper, that becomes a finer history than what the historians write. My translation is only approximation. But Mainali's key observation about marinated memories turning into finer history proves a general point that no recollection is completely random. They have a purpose that the rememberer chooses to present in a favorable light. I think I've forgotten the name. An American writer has written about his autobiography. Everything in this book happened. Something happened on the ground. Many things happened just in my mind. So that is the character of marinated memories. In this sense, Dixit's recollective mode contributes to the consolidation of mainstream discourse of Nepaliness. At this point, if you are wondering why I am using Dixits and Dixit to make my point, please remember that there are not many families in Nepal that can claim the distinction of having 4 generations of raconteurs written their memoir or autobiographies. One of the Dixits institutionalized Gorkha Bhasha Pracharani Samiti, Gorkha Language Promotion Committee, and a family-run trust, the Badan Puraskar Guti, has built up such a formidable reputation that one of its awards can easily elevate a person into a cultural celebrity or push a book to the bestsellers list. Sir Bahadur Pandey's 3-volume Tes Bakhat Ko Nepal of that time, starting with the last 3 decades of the Rana era, is an illuminating collection that sheds light on polity, society, culture, and economy of Nepal in the manner of a storyteller. Beautifully written. Despite the data frequently quoted in the text, its stories are more engaging. Madheshi, or Tarai in the language of the writer, gets a mention for its resources rather than the people. Though I have, on maybe third or fourth reading, I found that there is a sentence, Tarai Basiharulai pani Rashtriyatama Samavesh Garnuparcha, or something like that. In addition to being one of the most prominent journalists of Nepal, despite having been editor of various publications for several decades, he still occasionally writes what can be read as reported pieces. Kishore Nepal is a poet, an essayist, and a storyteller. His 476-page long memoir, Mero Samay, My Time, is rich in detail, but it lacks its signature style of easy readability and appears in places as a labored work rather than the labor of love. Even though he has a public reputation of being Madheshi friendly, the focus of his entire book, in its entirety, is upon the mainstream discourse. I don't know if it has always been the cause, but the flood of recollection, most of it without much reflection in the market over the last few years, has been amusing. It seems everybody who considers themselves to be somebody wants to tell their story. I have read some of them, flipped through many. Perhaps the need to document their lives and provide their side of the story for posterity increases in times of uncertainty like these. In addition to being a politician, he once challenged formidable Girja Prasad Koirala for the chairmanship of Nepali Congress. Narahari Acharya has also been a public commentator, writer, and an early supporter of Republican order. His Jiban Ko Pathsala, Samjhana Ra Sambandha, the School of Life, Recollections and Relationship, is a door-stopper in hardback with 636 pages. The autobiography of Surya Bahadur Thapa, Mero Nau Dasak, 5 Vyavastha, 5 Raja, 5 Patak Pradhan Mantri, by 9 decades, 5 systems, 5 kings, 5-time Prime Minister, result of the collective efforts of interviewer Kedar Sharma, writer Ganesh Paudel, and editor Hari Bahadur Thapa, apart from the narrator himself, is another tome, but the tome is similar. A celebration of life rather than an effort of looking back to produce an examined life. During the Panchayat era, especially in 1980, it was said that Tulsi Giri was Panchayat ko ama, mother of Panchayat. After the result of referendum in 1980s were announced, some of us used to argue that Surya Bahadur Thapa should call himself Panchayat ko Dhai Ama, foster mother of Panchayat, for the role that he had played in ensuring the victory of the system. The volume fails to dwell upon it in revealing details. I think it doesn't even need pointing out that both Acharya and Thapa have almost forgotten Madheshi, as if it didn't exist. Devendra Pandey has lived a varied life as a civil servant, a critical development economist, a campaigner for democracy, a politician, a civil society activist, and engaged intellectual. But in Ek Jan Dui Juni, One Body, Two Incarnation, he reduces this complexity to just 2 phases. Despite his reputation for being sympathetic to minorities, the memoir reads much like a work of mainstream. In private conversation, he is quite forthright in recognizing his privileges. Yet, like many public figures, he hesitates to acknowledge the extent to which his background enabled him to become one of the most prominent figures in Nepal between 1980 and 2000. I lived through many of the memoir recollections I had previously read to see whether I had missed any hint that the writer wished to question mainstream views. It seems I shall have to try harder to overcome my disappointment. Vek Bahadur Thapa recounts his contributions to public life in Rashtra Pararashtra Ek Tantra Dekhi Ganatantra Samma, Nation Foreign, Autocracy to Republic, co-written with Hari Bahadur Thapa. Navraj Subedi's Itihas ko ek kalkhanda, period of history, adds little to the public knowledge beyond some details of his private life, while Kesav Raj Bhandari's Sarvajanik Seva Ma Bite Ko Jeevan, a life spent in public service, reads more like a record of obedient service than of initiative or recollection. Once again, Madheshi on the margins or not even mentioned. The artillery notes that diplomatic diary by Rajesh Chautari has received seem to have been written without actually reading the book. A lot of people are praising it on the back flap. I doubt they read it because it is a straightforward recollection of a charmed life with no particularly path-breaking insight. Much the same can be said of Shambhu Prasad Gyavali's Vyakti Ra Vichar, Ek Vakil Ko Sansmaran Ra Chintan, Personality and Opinion, Memories and Reflections of a Lawyer, Himalaya Samsher's Samjana Ra Chintan, Remembrances and Musings, and Revti Raman Khanal's Anubhuti Ra Abhivyakti, Perception and Expression. These works fall into a common genre of unsubstantiated and therefore unconvincing self-glorification. The list is long, but I shall end with a special mention of Shankar Prasad Upreti's Jeevan Ek Sapna, a slim and unpretentious volume written in simple language that presents an inspiring story of struggle, recognition, and a lifelong commitment to social welfare. Even though Madheshi is not there, honestly told story sounds authentic and convincing. Some of the accounts written in English language aren't much better. Ram Prasad Pokhrel has done pioneering and commendable work in making quality treatment for the eyes available throughout the country over several decades. He should have at least hired an editor to produce Reaching the Unreached, 3 decades of struggle in Nepal. Leknath Belvase dwells too much upon happenstance in his strange forces of destiny to acknowledge the privileges of comfortable childhood of a Pahadi Bahun in Madhesh and the benefits of being born into the family of Panchayat politicos during absolute Saha rule. At least Belvase's narrative is easier to read than Pokhrel's book. Hisila Yami's journey from a revolutionary to quote-unquote first lady through childhood in Kathmandu, teen years in Kanpur, young adulthood at the School of Planning and Architecture in New Delhi, where she was a batchmate of iconoclastic but market-savvy writer Arundhati Roy, a budding feminist back in Kathmandu, a Maoist rebel for a decade, and a minister in the transitional cabinet overshadows the fact that she is also the life partners of academic overachiever and underachiever in performance, former Prime Minister Baburam Bhattarai. The book is competently edited and slickly produced. MP Koirala's A Role in the Revolution is noteworthy as a first-person account, some observations substantiated with letters and documents of tumultuous 1950s in the history of the country. In personal conversation, he used to sound very sympathetic towards Madheshi, but it doesn't occur in his writing. The central question of these publications' enduring literary relevance is moot. Their function transcends content analysis. By the very fact of their publication, they become appendages to the official record that reinforce the national memory. They add specific published voices to the evolving history, a process which inherently benefits and guarantees the dominance of the ruling elites and their shared narrative, irrespective of the strength or weaknesses of the material contained within. Now I come to almost the last chapter, the marginal notes. The recollection of Ram Raja Prasad Singh, published as Gantantra Ko Lagi Sangharsh, has been collected by journalist Sitaram Baral. When writing a chapter about him, I had several opportunities to interact with him, with the fiery Republican leader in Kathmandu as well as in Rajbiraj. He had considerably mellowed in his sunset years. In personal conversations, he appeared more sympathetic to the Madheshi and Janjati cause than in the published book. Singh was a scholar of English, spoke Hindi with the refinement of Banaras, with a touch of Urdu from Aligarh, the universities that he spent some time, and was comfortable in holding conversation in classical Maithili, the kind of Maithili that very few people speak now. Two of his most compelling pamphlets are in English and Hindi, but he chose to have his recollections published in Nepali for posterity. He had read Franz Fanon, that I know because he used to quote in personal conversation. So probably he was also aware of Franz Fanon, who says, quote unquote, to speak a language is to assume a culture, to support the weight of a civilization, but decided to be remembered as an authentic Nepali elite rather than a Madheshi. A retired Foreign Service official and former Ambassador Shyamanand Suman has recently come out with his memoir, Jeevan Ek Rang Anek, One Life Many Colors, that records his struggles and rewards in a long civil service career. The tone is once again predictable, something like, despite me being an authentic Nepali, I had to face the consequences of being a Desi. So authentic Nepali, you have to go on proving that. Writer Ganesh Prasad Lat is a Marwadi, and like most members of small but successful Marwadis, he makes no attempt to prove his genuineness of being a Nepali. Perhaps that's the reason authenticity shines through his Simant Samjana, marginal memories, even though conformism is the thread that binds his narration of life in Birganj. It would have been desirable to go through some more books for variety, but not many Madheshis have written their memoirs. Even the selection of mainstream voices here is completely random. Many important works have been left out of them because I couldn't locate it. After 2015, all my books fell on the ground, many of them put in a jute bag, so I could not locate them. But time stands apart as the one resource that consistently defies our attempts at management. The mainstream media reinforces biases and stereotypes without a second thought. Ravi Lamichhane built the foundation of his career in media with Buddha was born in Nepal, BWBIN, rhetoric. Actually, Prince Siddharth was born more than 2,500 years ago in Kapilvastu, which came into Nepalese territory less than 300 years ago. As an aside, BP can be credited to have given legitimacy to Buddha was born in Nepal with one of his observation that he did not find anybody to be proud of in Nepal's history other than Buddha. I am not a popular social media person, but from what I sometimes watch on YouTube, it appears their presentations are even more ethno-nationalistic, since presenters control the levers of conversation. Even Madheshi or Janjati guests to talk shows come out sounding conformist. The coinage Khas Arya word, institutionalized in Nepal's 2015 constitution, functions not merely as an administrative classification, but as a mechanism that helps preserve the long-standing dominance of Bahun Kshetri order. This dominance is locally specific and historically rooted, and while it is connected to wider Brahminical structures in South Asia, it operates through what may be described as a distinctly Bahunistic hegemony over the Nepali state, society, and public culture. Communities positioned outside this Bahunistic order, whether Madheshis or Janajatis, often find themselves competing to conform to the mainstream practices and values that underpin the Pahari-centric national imaginary. The reasons for this are not difficult to discern. The pressure to appear nationalistic, for instance, is frequently more pronounced among prominent Madhesis across caste, Hindu, Muslim, and Janjati backgrounds than among many Pahari Janajatis, a dynamic shaped by the long history of suspicion cast upon the Madhesi identity and belonging within the Nepali state. मधेसी अलिकति सफल भयो भने एकदम पहाडी जस्तो देख्नलाई, लुगा त्यस्तै लगाउने, बोल्ने त्यस्तै, त्यही मूल्य मान्यतालाई हामी गोर्खाली भन्न पनि अब हामी नेपाली भन्नेसम्म त ठिकै थियो, हामी गोर्खाली भनेर एकदम त्यो भाषामै आइहाल्दो रहेछ के। High achieving Madhesis often encounter significant pressure to conform to the mainstream Pahari-centric socio-political norms in Nepal, largely because institutions that define merit and success, such as the civil service, higher education, political parties, and the national media, remain structured around dominant Pahari cultural values. Within these spaces, Madhesi individuals are frequently required to adjust their linguistic practices, public behavior, and ideological positions in order to avoid eliciting suspicion or prejudice. This is partly a defensive strategy. Existing scholarship and public discourse have long illustrated how Madhesis are subjected to stereotypes concerning loyalty, authenticity, and Nepaliness. High achievers, who often operate as one of few Madhesis within elite institutions, must therefore manage the heightened scrutiny placed upon them and navigate the risk of being dismissed as too community-oriented, too provincial, or insufficiently aligned with the national mainstream. In such context, adopting the dominant narrative can serve to deflect accusations of bias or separatism and mitigate the pressures of tokenism. Furthermore, Madhesi achievers may temper their public views to avoid reinforcing negative stereotypes that their advancement is communal rather than individual, or that their presence signals ethnic politics, thereby opting for strategic neutrality to maintain institutional acceptance. यो चाहिँ मैले लेख्न त लेखेँ, नेपालीमा भने भए राम्रो हुन्थ्यो, तर this had to be in English, I thought, because this is one of the tactics when you are saying too controversial thing. It's just to make it so complicated that only those who will understand, who would like to analyze it and understand it. So this paragraph is complicated, with an intention. These dynamics are also influenced by deeper structural and psychological factors that shape the trajectories of upwardly mobile Madhesis. Social mobility often requires entering institutions where dominant group norms are not only culturally pervasive, but also implicitly framed as neutral and universal, merit-based. This can produce identity tensions. Individuals may feel compelled to negotiate between maintaining solidarity with Madhesi socio-political concerns and demonstrating conformity to the expectations of national institutions in which their success depends. I have many such examples, but mostly politicians in so-called mainstream political parties. I see people looking at their watches. I still have about, how many pages? 3 pages. So I'll make it faster. Some achievers consciously adopt mainstream perspective as a strategic means of cultivating credibility, access, and influence, with the long-term aim of effecting change from within rather than from the margins. For example, ex-President Ram Baran Yadav, but as he also found out, it seldom works. Others are influenced by internalized hierarchies that arise from prolonged exposure to narratives portraying Madhesi identity as less legitimate within the national imaginary. These internalized norms are not personal shortcomings, but predictable consequences of structural marginalization. Moreover, the burden of representation, where a single Madheshi individual is taken implicitly or explicitly to stand in for millions, creates strong incentives to avoid actions or viewpoints that could be interpreted negatively by dominant groups. Together, these pressures demonstrate that conformity among Madheshi high achievers is not a simple act of personal preference, but a complex response to intersecting demands of social survival, institutional power, and politics of visibility in contemporary Nepal. It is not surprising that the conformism seeps into narratives of Madhesis that have made it in life and managed to find grudging or artificial acceptance in the mainstream. This phenomenon appears to have been studied and theorized in socio-political contexts. From a political theoretical standpoint, mainstream literature functions as a key site in the production and maintenance of cultural hegemony. In Gramscian terms, hegemony is secured not simply through coercive power, but through the consent of the governed, achieved by presenting the dominant group's worldview as common sense. Literature as an institution embedded within publishing, education, and critical discourse becomes one of the central mechanisms through which this common sense is naturalized. I think it was in 2005 when eminent linguist Ram Avatar Yadav had dissected Dhruv Chandra Gautam's popular novel Alikit, Unwritten, as a part of his keynote address on being a Madheshi. It is a book that had won Madan Puraskar, probably for being one of the pioneering works of surrealism in the Nepali language. Gautam is a fine writer and writes about Madhesh with sensitivity. In his scholarly lecture, Yadav pointed out how sensitivity doesn't imply empathy and much less recognition of injustice. When a writer portrays a Madheshi character being served food in a kopra by Pahari masters, that is a scene in Alikit, Ramavatar Yadav translates kopra as pissing pan, but kopra is not just used for emptying the bladder. It is also a pan for defecating. So I think Dr. Yadav was being kind in his translation. It creates a subliminal image that strengthens master-servant relationship rather than questioning it. Portrayal matters as does its language and tone. It was after listening to Yadav that I began to, quote-unquote, read even BP's short stories with a different lens. Mainstream literature often reproduces the epistemic priorities of those who occupy positions of social and cultural dominance. It frames the marginalized not as subjects of history, but as peripheral figures within narratives centered on dominant identities. This dynamic is powerfully encapsulated in an African proverb, often attributed to Chinua Achebe: until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. The metaphor reveals how narrative authority determines not only what is remembered, but how it is remembered and for whom. Highlights how dominant groups shape narratives to their advantage, omitting or downplaying the perspectives of those they have subjugated. Post-colonial theorists have long argued that the literary canon is shaped by structures of power. As Gayatri Spivak's question, can art and speak, reminds us, the issue is whether marginal groups produce speech or written texts, but whether the discursive and institutional conditions exist for their voices to be heard, validated, and circulated. In many cases, mainstream literature speaks for the marginalized. Sometimes it does, translating their experiences through the interpretive frameworks of the powerful. Even sympathetic portrayals may consolidate hegemony by situating the dominant subject as a mediator, interpreter, or savior. This form of representational control converts literature into an ideological apparatus. It sanctions certain imaginaries while foreclosing others, thereby shaping public perceptions of marginal communities. Stereotypes, romanticization, or the erasure of structural violence become woven into the cultural fabric, informing both social policy and everyday interactions. The marginalized are frequently rendered as objects of knowledge rather than producers of knowledge. The emergence of literature written by marginalized communities, therefore, not merely an aesthetic development, but a political intervention. Sometimes they say कि शब्दहरू लिनुपर्छ, उनीहरूको कथाहरू ल्याउनुपर्छ. But that's not just that. It's not just an aesthetic development, but a political intervention. When the hunted write their own history, or dominant group. Elsewhere, Dalit autobiographies, black feminist writing, indigenous storytelling, and other counter-hegemonic literatures produce what Gramsci would call a war of position, a sustained challenge to dominant cultural narratives through the slow transformation of meaning, memory, and value. Such texts refuse the passive position allocated to them by the mainstream canon. They reassert narrative agency, expose the structures of domination that shape everyday life, and articulate alternative epistemologies that unsettle the limits of what is taken to be universal. In doing so, they move cultural field closer to what a French philosopher, Jacques Rancière, might call dissensus, distribution of sensible that allows previously inaudible voices to enter the sphere of political and aesthetic recognition. It is difficult to such voices emerging from the margins in Nepal. From Madheshi is almost non-existent. Ultimately, the struggle over literature is inseparable from the struggle over political subjectivity. Only when marginalized communities can narrate themselves on their own terms in a language which can sometimes also be of the dominant group. Many African writers have written in English and in French. Many South American writers have written in Portuguese, Spanish, equally powerfully. And when those narratives are afforded equal legitimacy within the cultural sphere, can the hegemonic order be fully confronted? It was not my intention to theorize, but अलिअलि त्यो गन्धले पनि आउँछ त्यो मार्टिन चौतारीको गफ सुन्ने गरे अनि त्यो थ्योरी निस्किहाल्दो रहेछ क्या त्यहाँ. I ended up dabbling in doing something I don't know much. With that, I admit my ignorance and request the informed listeners to discover complexities of the genre themselves and find whether they need to examine their own convictions. Winter afternoons in Kathmandu are made for something else than listening to a long lecture in a foreign language. But for me, even Nepali is a foreign language, so it goes. Thank you for your patience despite the winter week.
हामी सबैको तर्फबाट CK दाइलाई धन्यवाद. लेक्चर लामो थियो र तपाईहरुले अरूहरुलाई के भन्दिनु होला भने यो लेक्चर चाहिँ इभेन्चुअली पब्लिश हुन्छ. एक्ज्याक्टली कहिले हुन्छ भने मैले भन्न सकिनँ, तर we might ask him to provide some citations or provide them for him. We've done that for a lot of other people in the past as well. So on behalf of Chautari and on behalf of everyone in the Angan, I'd like to thank you again. So one more. With this event, this year's 2025 annual Chautari annual conference has ended. But before I invite you to tea, मैले चाहिँ हाम्रो यो कन्फरेन्स सम्पन्न गर्नमा सहयोग गर्ने हुने भोलिन्टियर्सहरु र अरु साथीहरुलाई धन्यवाद दिनुपर्छ. So I'm just going to read हाम्रो कलिग्सहरुको नाम. भोलिन्टियर्सहरु अर्जुन मोहरा, Asmita Pandey, Diksha Pandey, Nikita Tripathi, Prasamsa Guru, Samyang Limbu, Vanisha Rai, Yadav Varyal, Yogina Shrestha. On behalf of Chautari and on behalf of all the paper presenters, moderators, participants, we'd like to thank you for making the conference possible. Obviously, the conference wouldn't have been possible without the paper presenters. So, 3 दिने थुप्रै प्यानल्समा पेपर प्रस्तुत गर्ने सबै प्रस्तोताहरूलाई हाम्रो धन्यवाद। हाम्रो अनुरोध स्वीकार गरेर ती प्यानल्सहरू मोडरेट गरिदिने moderators who have the double duty of both keeping time as well as commenting on the papers presented, उहाँहरूलाई पनि धन्यवाद। र पेपर सुन्नका लागि आउनुभएका पार्टिसिपेन्ट्सहरू र I was very encouraged, we were all encouraged to see lots of new faces this year, उहाँ पार्टिसिपेन्ट्सहरूलाई पनि धन्यवाद। अरू वर्षमा भन्दा पनि कम यो वर्ष चाहिँ कन्फरेन्सको आयोजना गर्ने जुन पूर्व तयारीमा खासै म संलग्न हुन पाइनँ, अलिक बिरामी भएको थिएँ। तर a lot of our colleagues and interns have contributed many hours of the time, the energy, their planning to make the conference possible. यसमा चाहिँ म बिसना श्रेष्ठ, बुद्ध श्रेष्ठ, देवेन्द्र उप्रेती, दलबहादुर श्रेष्ठ, बेरा कञ्चन केसी, ईश्वर प्रधान, माया मानन्दर, प्रस्ता प्रधान, रूप गुरुङ, सञ्जिला मोक्तान, समीक्षा पाण्डे, सुनिता तामाङ, सुशील चलाउने र कन्फरेन्सको कमान्डर इन चिफ रमेश पराजुलीलाई धन्यवाद। So now I invite all of you for some tea.